Hey guys, this is Mr. O'Brien here, and in this video, we're going to be talking about the factors that can contribute to the development of new species. So this is your part 2 of your topic 7 evolution chapter. And again, last section we talked about natural selection and how organisms are selected by nature. So again, natural selection is the mechanism which evolution occurs. Now we're going to talk about how this mechanism could lead to the formation of new species. So speciation is just simply the formation of a new species over time as the result of evolution. So for example, if we have a new species that comes into an area, over millions upon millions of years, it's not going to remain the same. Most likely, if it's new, it's going to split into different organisms that are able to do different things. So most likely what they eat, how they eat it, and eventually it keeps going, it keeps evolving, till eventually we have two unidentifiably different species that have occurred. They eat different things, like bugs or something like that, compared to seeds, like the two in the finches that we see here. Again, speciation, formation of new species. Now, an example that we have here are these two fish called porkfish. Now, porkfish 3.5 million years ago were the same thing because there was no barrier at this Isthmus of Panama. The ocean actually go through there. So in other words, the Atlantic or the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean were still able to mix. Well, 3.5 million years ago, we had a solid landmass form between those two oceans. Therefore, these two new species no longer swam between each other. They were no longer able to interbreed. Therefore, they became two distinguishably different species. Okay? So in other words, they were experiencing different selective pressures. Therefore, they evolved in different ways, natural selection, that they formed two new species. Now, there's a couple different ways for species to form. The first one we have is geographic isolation. So geographic isolation is caused by a mountain or river, and that mountain or river forms a barrier between a population, and both experience speciation independently. So the example that we have here, and the best one I like to use, are these ground squirrels down here. Now, these ground squirrels, they used to be the same species, but there was this giant valley that occurred between them. You guys may know it as the Grand Canyon, that actually split the populations between each other. Now, because they were no longer able to interact with each other, they experienced natural selection, evolution, and speciation differently. Therefore, we have the formation of two different ground squirrels in this location. So this was pretty much due to a physical barrier that occurred between it. And in geographic isolation, it's some sort of geographic thing, like a mountain, a river, a valley, something that is unsurpassable by one another. Now, reproductive isolation is a little bit different. Reproductive isolation, the organisms are still interacting with one another, but it's the fact that their reproductive cycles don't line up the same way. So species evolve separately enough that they can no longer breed successfully because they have a different breeding procedure. So if we look here, the wood frog, peak breeding time is April 1st. The pickerel frog, peak breeding time is May 1st. The tree frog, peak breeding time is June 1st, and the bullfrog is July 1st. So even though all of these frogs probably live in the same environment, the same ecosystem, they never interbreed because their breeding cycles are off. So, because their breeding cycles don't overlap with one another, they are not able to interbreed, not able to pass on their traits to one another, and they become separate species because they don't interact with one another. Now, geographic isolation and reproductive isolation, they may occur simultaneously with one another. So, for example, if we look at the top here, we have some sort of physical isolation that is separating these three species on this mountain. Now, over time, what happens is these three species are separated and they are no longer able to interbreed. So they become their own species, which you can see with the three colors up here. So even if the species are able to interbreed later on, they still are three different species because now reproductive isolation has occurred and they're no longer able to reproduce with one another. So physical isolation can also lead to reproductive isolation a little bit later on. So in terms of evolution, individuals do not evolve, populations evolve. So populations are the smallest thing that can evolve. So if you want to think about it, an individual can have a mutation, but if that mutation is not beneficial or is not able or allowing them to interbreed, it means nothing. In order for evolution to take place, it has to occur throughout the entire population. So evolution is a permanent change in the genes of the population and not just of a single individual. So we have a couple mechanisms that allow evolution to occur. The first one we have is gene flow. So for example, immigration, let's go purple here. Immigration is where an organism leaves an area. Okay, immigration is when an organism comes in. So as these organisms are leaving and coming in, they're also moving their genes with them. So for example, we have population 1 here that is composed of both dominant alleles and recessive alleles. Now white here is the recessive allele. So if a white goose is moving to a population that is dominated by all dominant alleles, the recessive allele is now introduced into this community. So the movement of organisms' genes is called migration. So again, now this population went from having all dominant alleles to having some recessive, and it changes the entire allele frequency in the population. So again, one way that organisms can move their genes. Now, this may cause, or another way that organisms' genes or traits could change is a process called genetic drift. So genetic drift is a phenomenon by which allele frequencies of a population change as a result of a random event or chance. So it's usually caused by a natural disaster. So think about it like there's a community of bugs, and those bugs are wiped out except for all of the red ones. For some reason, who knows the reason, now the population of red ones are the ones that are dominating. So what they always use for for genetic drift is like, think about a fly swatter, okay? So in this ratio right here, we have 5-to-5 ratio, 5 red, 5 blue. Now let's just say you're out camping and these beetles live on your picnic table, and you decide to take a big swat at them, and you kill 4 of the blue beetles. So now what you did is you reduced the population from 5-to-5 to 5-to-1. When reproduction occurs, now you have a red-dominated population. Again, you swatting the 4 blue ones was just a random chance, but that random chance can alter the allele frequency very drastically. So this could also lead to what's known as a bottleneck effect. So the bottleneck effect is an extreme example of genetic drift that happens when the size of a population is severely reduced. Sorry about that. So what's happening is, the bottleneck, only a few species are able to go into the surviving population because of a natural disaster. So let's just say by random chance there were 4 different colors, but only 2 of them made it into the next population, and for the most part, most of them were pink. So again, it's a random assortment of the survivors that can lead to a drastic change in the population. So another mechanism for evolution is what's known as the founder effect. The founder effect is another extreme example of drift. And what happens is, let's just say an organism picks up, flies away, and goes to a different deserted island. Well, now, let's just say a small portion of them, like right here, leave, and the majority of them are yellow. Therefore, the new population is going to be majority of yellow because of what actually left. So as a result of the loss of genetic variation, the new population may be distinctly different, both genotypically and phenotypically from the parent population in which it derived. Again, founder effect is just Think of it like a small portion of it are picked up and moved to a different location. This could drastically change the organisms that are there. So Darwin had a theory, and when he went to the Galapagos Islands, he collected a species or a bunch of different species of specimens, including birds. Now, each species differed mainly in the size and shape of their beak, and he noticed this. Why are all these very similarly looking finches have different sizes and shapes of beaks? Well, what happened was these birds were adapting for a different food source. So up here we have the cactus ground one. His beak looks different than the ground finch, which looks different than the tree finch. Okay, because all of them are adapted differently to eat different foods on the island. So what he discovered was this theory of adaptive radiation. And this is where a species rapidly diversifies to form or to fit into new forms or to fit into new niches. So this occurs most often when a new species encounters a new change of the environment. So for example, here is our ancestral bird here. And what happened, depending on what food they eat, depends on what they will look like in later generations. So new ecosystems have new niches, and these niches or spaces or roles that the organisms within play. So when a founder species get there, it's going to adaptively radiate out to fill these new niches of the location. Hopefully this video helps you out. Again, this is the end of your part 2 video of evolution.